So thank you all so much for joining us today at TCAF 2021. Welcome to Health Scare, Personal and Global Perspectives. My name is Miles Baker. I'm the Executive Director of the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, and so very pleased you could join us today for Digital TCAF, the weirdest TCAF ever. Special thanks today have to go to Seneca College School of Creative Arts and Animation, our programming sponsor for all of this year's program. Would not have been possible without them this year. Before I hand things off to Glenn for today's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land that I am on, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Wendat peoples. I'm joining you today from my home, which is in the territory that was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations. This area is also covered by Treaty 13, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We make this acknowledgement as part of a long process in learning what it means to live, work, and make art on colonized lands. Going forward, TCAF is committed to increasing Indigenous perspectives and voices in our programming for every year going forward. The moderator for today's program is Dr. Glenn Downey, who is a children's author, graphic novelist, literary critic, and an award-winning teacher. He is currently the chair of English and drama at the York School in Toronto, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to Glenn.
Thanks, Miles. So good morning, or good afternoon rather, everyone. I'm going to just get us set up here with a little introduction to our panelists and to the panel today. So I hope you can all see that. So one second, perfect. Can we all see that? I think we can now. Perfect. Welcome. So, good afternoon. As Miles said, my name is Dr. Glenn Downey, and I currently teach at the York School here in Toronto. I write comics and graphic novels in the educational publishing industry, as Miles might have mentioned, and for the past decade, I've served as a reviewer for PW Comics World, the graphic novel division of Publishers Weekly. I thought a long time about how to begin this particular panel called Health Scare, especially since we're 16 months or so into a global pandemic. And it struck me that any attempt on my part to come up with something particularly witty or clever wouldn't be. Instead, I just want to congratulate all of you who are here, panelists and attendees, for being here, because I think we can agree that for more than a few of you, arriving here has come with some measure of hardship and suffering. This has been a year of hardship and of statistics and of staying inside and wondering whether the world is ever going to be the same place again. But it's been a year of these things in addition to what we must normally endure, except that this past year, as far as normal years go, is the opposite of normal. I'm not really sure I quite understand how people have managed to keep it together. I mean, I get how I've managed it. I'm an educator whose school reorganized itself to protect teachers and students and staff. I took the step of going online at the start of the third wave before the province did. And I've been working from home for a sizable part of the academic year. I was vaccinated last month, haven't missed a pay. My children received funding last summer because they didn't have the opportunity to find a summer job. So if I tell you how badly I've been hurting as a result of the pandemic, I think probably many of you have been hurting more. I realize that others have been able to work let alone from home, haven't been vaccinated, have had funding that hasn't been able to keep them or to help them weather what has happened to them with anything approaching what it needed in order to be able to do that. What health scares should teach us, I think, is about the need to see things from other people's perspectives. I think that's really important. And I think that's true irrespective of whether those health scares happen in the midst of a pandemic. Today, I'm honored to talk with people for whom the notion of a health scare has profound meaning, who have spent time over the last number of months or last number of years putting these works together. And so what I want to do is now to introduce our panelists for today. So Hana and Kujawa is from Banff, Alberta. She has a BFA from Emily Carr University in Victoria, BC, is currently studying at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University in Halifax. Mandi Kujawa lives in Banff, Alberta. She's a singer and storyteller who also works as a librarian. She runs a youth choir for elementary children in Banff and engages them with her narratives. In addition to A Slug Story, she is the author of the children's book, Jacqueline and the Singing Crow, which is also published by Renegade. Kendra Boileau is the publisher of Graphic Mundi and the assistant director and editor-in-chief of Penn State University Press. She developed the graphic medicine line of graphic novels for PSU Press and went on to launch the Graphic Mundi imprint in 2021. Boileau has been a judge for the annual Lynn Ward Prize for the best graphic novel, and she serves on the Lynn Ward Prize Advisory Board. Boileau is also a French to English translator of graphic novels. Maureen Burdock is a maker and scholar of comics. She was born in the Black Forest in Germany in 1970, so I definitely predate you. She grew up during the Cold War era in Germany and the United States, and her creative and scholarly work examines topics like displacement, gender, memory, and trauma. Burdock is currently working on The Baroness of Have Nothing, which is a graphic memoir that is her dissertation in the Cultural Studies program at the University of California, Davis. Before working toward her PhD, she earned an MFA in studio art and an MA in visual and critical studies from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. She's a creator of Feminist Fables for the 21st Century, the F-Word Project, which is a series of graphic fables that address forms of gender-based violence in several cultures, published by McFarland Books in 2015. So what I want to do today, I think, my plan for this afternoon is to have guests consider some questions that I've prepared for them to talk about their work. And then eventually I'd like to open up to questions in the chat. And so if you are a panelist here or as rather an attendee, you should have a little Q&A box in which you can place questions, and then hopefully we have a chance to address some of them, probably in about the last 15 minutes of the panel or so. So my first question that I wanted to ask is for Mandi and Hana. I'm trying to understand, and because I know it has a really interesting story, what's the inspiration of A Slug Story? I'm interested both in the circumstances that brought it about, but also that led to the development of the title or the idea of A Slug Story. Because my understanding from what I've read about you is it came about in a slightly unusual way.
Hana, you or me?
Go ahead.
Well, one of Hannah's friends was over at the house and he said, you know, Mandi, I've got a brilliant idea for a kid's story. And I kind of inwardly rolled my eyes and thought, if it's such a brilliant idea, use it yourself, you know, don't give it to me. But, and then he said, it's about a slug that stays a slug. And for me, it just lit me on fire. And I was actually having a nice time visiting with him, but I actually just wanted him to go, because it struck something that I've been thinking for years working with kids, that there's a problem with everybody writing kids books or giving kids the message that they're all going to go off to these brilliant lives. And some people live like slugs for their whole life. And how do you wrap your head around that and enjoy what it is to be a slug? Maybe not be as fantastic as a butterfly.
Hannah?
Yeah, so that was the mom's great idea for a book. And then it kind of got influenced when we were spending time in the hospital, and I had written an essay, and we kind of brought all our ideas together, and it turned into this graphic novel.
Amazing. Maureen and Kendra, how did you sort of respectively decide to write stories about this past year in COVID? And then also, in the case of you, Kendra, putting this together in an anthology, what was the sort of the inspiration for that, other than COVID itself? So we'll start with Kendra first. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted, Kendra.
I warned you that I would do that. The idea for this anthology came last March, just as the pandemic was blowing up on our shores in North America. And it was a time of great upheaval at Penn State University Press. We were planning to launch the new Graphic Mundi comics imprint in the coming August. And release these books that are behind me, or the new books in the imprint, release them in the fall, but we realized that we would have to postpone the launch of the imprint to January. At the same time, we were closing our warehouse that was mandated by our university, and that foreclosed on the promise of quite a bit of sales revenue for the next 3 months. Our staff were scrambling to work from home. And all this while, we were watching the maelstrom of the pandemic unfold, with Seattle as ground zero first, New York as ground zero, and the rest is history. So it was an ideal time, actually, for me to sit back and take a breath and figure out how to create something somewhat positive or constructive out of this mess. At the same time, I was in tune with a lot of the short comics that were being published by creators everywhere, pretty much, online venues, Twitter, Instagram, on the Nib. There were so much production was coming out, and so we had the idea to collect short comics into a print volume that would first of all offer a print forum for comics creators who were working on COVID comics, and then also publish a book that would give back in some ways. So all of the creators to this anthology very generously donated their work, and proceeds from the sale of this volume are going to BINC, the Book Industry Charitable Foundation, to support those who work in the book industry and who have been affected by the pandemic. And so I put out a call in March, and the idea, what I said in my call, was that the plan was to publish a memorable collection of comics that speaks not only to our generation, but to generations to come, something that we could put on our shelf. And that was that. So for the next 6 months, I collected comics, and we went from there.
Amazing. Maureen, the process of writing in terms of this whole question of what led you to write the story that you did.
Yeah, well, it just was such a void of, of things to do that felt meaningful during this maelstrom of things that were happening, not just the pandemic, but then the horrific killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And being somebody who makes comics about trauma, it just made sense to respond to how these things were intertwined, these very political events of systemic racism, and then the pandemic and the ways in which I saw it affecting different populations in different ways, depending on, who, as you brought up, Glenn, earlier, who was more vulnerable than others. And I was in a fairly safe space. I had some income coming in. I have a nice place to live, and I'm not, in a high risk group myself. So I felt like, okay, I have this ability to do something meaningful. And even though drawing a comic sometimes feels small, it feels like the thing that I can do best. So it just felt like this really urgent thing, and some way in which I could engage in a meaningful way. So I've worked with Kendra before and with Penn State Press. So when I saw the call, it was just a no-brainer. And then I attended a virtual event that was a global human rights and the pandemic talk at UC Davis, and heard a speaker, Joanna Regulska, who's an administrator with us and a wonderful feminist scholar. And I asked her if she'd be willing to speak with me a few times as I developed this comic. And so we developed a wonderful friendship through that. And that was also a real highlight, those early kind of Zoom meetings where you reached out and you got to connect with people in meaningful ways. That was such a lifesaver. So that was a big part of what made it meaningful for me.
That's awesome. So this leads me to my next question, which was unscripted, but then suddenly today I was thinking about it. I'm like, oh my God, I haven't asked them this question, which makes sense given that the time in which we're living, but also the nature of your working relationships. So with Hana and Mandi, I'm wondering about the idea of a mom and a daughter working together. And then specifically also with Maureen and Kendra, just the process of creating and compiling and working in this environment that we've seen over the course of the last year, the challenges presented, especially given the nature of what you're actually writing about. So we'll start with Mandi and Hana.
Well, the biggest challenge was to have Hana believe that she had written the story with me, because one of the features of her illness was that this daughter with an absolutely amazing memory has huge holes in her memory. And so sometimes, she didn't even believe. I had to produce the essay that she wrote that became, the inspiration that kind of took it beyond just this story about a slug. And then reassure her quite often that no, remember, and then, well, I didn't say remember because she didn't remember, but I'd say, you helped me with this, and then you helped me with this part. And then, so that was a very different challenge.
But working on it, even though I forget most of the process, was also something for us to do when I didn't have much of a life, working through some health issues. It was something that we could work on together.
Awesome, amazing.
And I'll also say then when Hana, when she was going in for her brain surgery and had the idea of taking the Polaroid camera with her and saying, okay, Mom, you need to take photos. And then she took photos and I took photos, and it just changed the experience by being asked to look at it somewhat artfully. Right. And then we had no idea at that point. It was just, that was in and of itself something to do. And then when we approached Alexandra and said, how do you feel about us putting this into a little piece at the end? Just thank God that she'd had the idea of bringing the Polaroid along.
Yeah. Well, that marriage too, you see that in so many great graphic novels, the acknowledgement of photography, the importance of recording experience. I think of that amazing scene of the dad in Persepolis, right, where he's out taking the photographs of what's happening around him and that sort of thing, right? That understanding in a visual narrative, that acknowledgement of photography. Awesome, Kendra and Maureen, working in this particular past year in that environment, the challenges that it posed. So we'll start with Kendra in terms of the compiling.
Are you talking about logistical challenges?
Yeah, I'm talking about, those kinds of challenges and yeah.
Well, so quite a few of our contributors to the volume are collaborative teams, and I'm sure the pandemic affected some of those groups, and I know that a lot of communication among them was done virtually. The same goes for me compiling this collection, and even if it weren't a pandemic, I would be working with authors to compile an anthology virtually. However, I will say that for me personally, the opportunity to connect with people, just as Maureen was saying that her connections with Joanna were very meaningful and special. So same goes for me. The opportunity to work with 70 some people, creators on their projects, helped keep me sane, as I was in lockdown and dealing with being cut off from family and friends. So I guess I would say that the ability to connect with people, communicate, and put this together had a special resonance considering what we were all living through.
Maureen?
I guess no particular challenges, because making comics, making graphic narratives is a pretty solitary activity. So I think something that I came across when I first started sketching this and writing it was just getting all of the information, the correct information, because there's so much misinformation and confusing, contradictory information in the beginning. When COVID was first became recognized as an issue. And so some of the facts, like, where did it come from? Did it come from bats? Did it come from, livestock? Was it artificially manufactured as part of a sinister conspiracy somewhere? So, just kind of looking through the different facts and making sure that I was representing things correctly, and Kendra helped me with that as well. So I think it did probably come from bats and then went to livestock, but we'll probably never know for sure because bats are reluctant to be interviewed.
They are. That's true. That is true. So for Mandi and Hana again, one question I had was about just the whole idea of I myself, my son William, when he was 16 months old, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I can remember when that was the case, something that people would commonly say to me when they found out was, oh, that's so great, because he'll always have lived with it and he'll never know what it was like to have sort of like a normal life. What is the most challenging thing in terms of this, embracing this topic of health scares and also healthcare? What's been the most challenging attitude to deal with in going through an experience like that? Because I see so strongly how you showcase sort of the care of those that that help the protagonist, the healthcare workers and all that in the graphic novel. So what's the most challenging thing to deal with in your experience?
Me? For me, first of all, people saying to me, well, Hana has epilepsy because you and your husband got divorced. Okay. So that was kind of harsh. And then they would tell Hana she has epilepsy because she manifested it.
Fun times, right?
Yeah, that would be hard to deal with. My God. Hana?
Yeah, I've received all sorts of strange comments. I mean, luckily enough, I've had so many seizures, I don't really remember many of those rude comments and who they came from. But it has, yeah, it's been interesting what many people have said, and then learning how to explain it differently over time so that I kind of receive better compliments or, different comebacks from whoever I'm talking to. But it is interesting how many people, a lot of people are lovely and try and say the right thing, but even then, oh, don't worry, they'll figure it out, or, oh, it's all going to turn around, it's all going to come back. And you're like, well, for a lot of things, it's not really how it works, but thank you for the good intention.
Yeah.
It's just, you have to kind of learn to hear it differently over time instead of getting frustrated with every comment. But
yeah, I've had the will he grow out of it a question a lot. Absolutely. Maureen and Kendra, I was curious about how your work and your contributions to Anthology has impacted your thinking about the experience of living through COVID. So how has that process of writing impacted your thinking about things?
I'll let Kendra go first again, because you always have the whole overview, having compiled the anthology.
Okay. Well, it helped me. First of all, the human connection helped me a lot, as I mentioned earlier. But secondly, as comics would come in, and invariably they would have a different perspective as the pandemic wore on, and we realized this was becoming a bigger thing than just a short-term health scare. Each of those comics was a sort of foothold for me to pause and think about the issue from a new perspective, and I was really grateful for that opportunity. And then just the exercise of bringing all of these comics together as sort of puzzle pieces to a larger picture helped me again, understand what the problems were, what needed to change, and that sort of thing, and certainly helped me engage with the goings on in, again, a more constructive way rather than being in total despair.
Yeah, the anthology. I just want to give a plug for the anthology, that it's pretty wonderful, and just seeing all of these different perspectives together now, of course, is amazing. And also, I just was able to see what some of the other cartoonists were doing online, through Facebook and Instagram. I could see what people around the world were doing, and colleagues of mine as far away as India, geographically far away, and what they were experiencing. That was very different from what we were experiencing here in the States. So it was great that way. And then doing my own comic was kind of like seeing all of the others out there kind of gave me a sense of what was being said and what was being addressed, and what I felt wasn't so much being addressed yet. So, and then by doing it, I also learned, of course, a lot about the state of the world and how things connect. So it made it even more clear to me, these connections between global events and the pandemic, and what was happening with healthcare, and who had access and who didn't, and who was really vulnerable and who wasn't so much. And so it just gave me an even more precise sense of how very interconnected everything is, and seeing myself as part of a global community that's dealing with this. So it gave me a sense of not being alone through the pandemic. And also we had these graphic medicine drawing together groups, which are really wonderful, which started kind of right at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were weekly for a few months. They were every week. We would get together on Sundays on Zoom, cartoonists and healthcare people and scholars all over the world, and just draw, and somebody would lead it, and it would give us this sense of community. So that really was amazing. And they still happen once a month.
That is amazing. Kendra, I had a question actually come in, and I just wanted to ask you a question in the chat. And it's, how did you think about organizing such a large volume? Like, was your goal to sort of pair narratives with each other? If people were reading the book in order, was it more so that people could read a specific excerpt, like a really short story, like one at a time? Like, what was sort of the rationale about the way that you organized it?
Yeah, that was a tough question. And actually, as time went on, we decided to double the size of the volume because we were getting so much wonderful content, and because the issues were exploding into very big things. So yeah, so there was a lot to organize at the end, and I tried several approaches. You know, I hope what I landed on works a little bit. I mean, I have heard from many people who say they can't sit down and read it in a full sitting, and I can completely understand that. But I tried to loosely group. So first of all, I wanted to follow a slightly chronological timeline. You know, so for example, Maureen's comic where she's referencing George Floyd's murder, you know, comes later. There are a lot of getting the virus, Jason Chatfield's, you know, what he experienced getting it and recovering from the virus, and then what it's like to be in quarantine, that sort of thing. And then we sort of progress into the heavier issues as things like economic inequalities and unequal access to healthcare and social racism, xenophobia, social injustice, poor leadership, you know, at on a global level. So I tried to start with, I didn't want to start out by hitting the reader with too much. So, you know, the early stages of the pandemic, and then, you know, ratcheted up the sadness factor to include some of the really hard-hitting comics, like losing a loved one to COVID. And then I tried to find ways to intersperse a little bit of light humor, although that was really kind of hard to do because I didn't want to be disrespectful to the fact that someone died in a previous comic. So I had comics by Rivi Handler-Spitz, who does amazing one-pagers, and she graciously allowed me to intercalate those throughout the collection. I get to a kids section. There is a grouping of a lot of comics that deal with kids' experiences, and most of those tend to be hopeful, which is nice. And then I sort of go back into the really heavy stuff, like Maureen's comic is there, Kay Sohini's comic is there. She points out how this pandemic has brought to light pretty much everything that's wrong with society. So she's dealing with some really heavy topics. We do that, and then I think we end up with the World Leaders series of baseball cards that highlight 3 world leaders who have been handling the pandemic pretty well, and how they've been doing that. 3 other world leaders, you might guess who they are, who were failing. And it was interesting to me that no one did anything on Anthony Fauci. And I wanted Anthony Fauci to appear somewhere. And so we decided to make a baseball card for him as well, following the world leaders. He's the MVP, the most valued physician. This series is drawn by Eli Nugeboren, by the way, and he did a wonderful job. Oh yeah, that's the Fauci baseball card. And then, so right following that is a piece by John Jennings. So we're winding up the collection. Piece by John Jennings and Jasmine Joyner, which is kind of surreal, speculative. There's a cat, a woman who is struggling by being homebound. And her cat is able to walk through walls and disappear, and she sees her cat across the way in other people's apartments. Then the cat comes back, and I feel like this is a spoiler alert, but at the end of the piece, I thought it was kind of an uplifting message, but you know, a little more surreal. And then I followed that with a wordless comic. So this is a point where we're wrapping up a volume after 6 months of collecting, and we still are in a mess and we don't know what's going to happen. And in the US, the elections are coming up, and, you know, there's still, so how do you wrap up a collection with any sort of sense of finality? So I followed that with a wordless comic by Hatice Garip, who's from Turkey. And that's sort of more of a ethereal, has an ethereal tone, metaphysical tone. And then, yeah, that's pretty much the end. I mean, I do end with a couple nice, you know, what is the Terry one? Make love, not COVID, you know. So anyway, my point was to try to give the reader some breaks, follow some general, but end on a note of ambiguity, because we were and still are, you know, in a moment of uncertainty. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, awesome. Great question. Great question. And another great question from the chat is for Hana and Mandi. What about for Hana and Mandi, what about the process of collaborating with an illustrator? What was that process like in the context of putting together the book? Because it's such a, I think, a kind of perfect illustration of what, you know what I mean? It's like the perfect illustrator for that book. So how did that work?
Well, I had worked with Claude Saint-Aubin on Jacqueline the Singing Crow. So I knew his work and I knew what he was like to work with. And with Jacqueline, he would send a drawing and then ask if I had any, you know, suggestions or things. And I knew that was a rare privilege. That often that's not how that works. And so I was so grateful for that. And then when it came time to do A Slug Story, I actually ended up severely sick and needing my own neurologist, which seems like really rotten luck in a two-person family to have two neurologists. Not good odds. And so in that case, I had to just kind of like let it go. And that wasn't hard to do, because with Alexander and Claude, and then Laverne coming in later, and our wonderful letterer, like, was their comic royalty. So
yeah, amazing. Yeah, that's so, yeah, I mean, it's great when one, you know, I always like, as a writer, the artists that have worked on projects, like, I always feel incredible gratitude, just this profound sense of gratitude. Yes, like, I just, and I mean, I think that's just in looking across the work in both of your books, like, I'm just amazed, right? This, I think, like, for me, another question that I had, and maybe I'll start with Hannah and Mandi again. That has to do, and I'm kind of interested about this, because I think this is like as a English person, in terms, or a literature person, the whole question of critical distance, right? There's a tradition in literature of works that have been created with great critical distance, and ones that aren't, you know, and so, to your mind, I'd be fascinated about your perspective on this, given how your books came about and things that were happening at the times when you were writing or thinking or conceptualizing them. So what do you think about that, Mandi and Hana, in terms of like writing with or without that critical distance? How does one do that?
Well, I'm going to say the thing that was so helpful is that there was no distance. We were in the experience and also trying to make notes about it at the same time. And I'm going to just say, well, we didn't know things with Hana were going to go the direction that they did. But just having that practice of like having this terrible experience in the hospital, but then like, okay, maybe we'll take some notes and you know, so that somebody else might not have to suffer this. There's a page that the kids draw in the story where they sort of help people to know what to say and what not to say to people in the hospital. And so it was so helpful to be having this terrible experience and not just be burning up with frustration, but put pen to paper.
And Hannah?
Yeah, it was helpful to just also have something to work on, to focus my mind away from the crazy hospital and the weird memory stuff. There was something to concentrate on because I was really upset to be taken away from my university. I had to take different years off while they were trying to figure out what was wrong with my head. And so having something else to work on and concentrate on and think that could maybe help someone else, but even just to make something that I can read later or just do something creative was really helpful instead of just sitting there and, you know, trying to enjoy someone else's book or listening to music. It was like more productive.
Awesome. So I want to ask the same question of Maureen and Kendra, but Candace in the chat here has asked like the perfect follow-up question. So for Kendra and Maureen especially, I think the question is, it seems like the issue of distance is different when creating about your own experiences compared to representing the experience of others. I'd be interested, Kendra and Maureen, what you think about that. The whole idea, for instance, Maureen, of writing about COVID and you know, the George Floyd image and that sort of thing, these things that are happening in current. So in terms of writing about others' experiences, how do you address that issue of having critical distance? I only think of that one story in the anthology. It's like, this happened in March 2020 when we didn't realize what, you know, that story, right? Like when we didn't know what was, you know, happening or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about that, Maureen or Kendra?
I guess I think it's kind of like when we talk about, you know, having the optimal teachable moment, there's this perfect combination of being really uncomfortable because you don't know exactly what's happening or what's going to happen next. And at the same time, you also have this grounding, this base of knowledge from past experiences. So, you know, there is no making sense of something like a pandemic. It's like a tornado or a hurricane or something like this. And even the political events, aside from protesting and making work about it, there's this sense of helplessness in a way that you're being swept, you know, away by this current of something really horrible that you can't really address in the moment. But then at the same time, there are some things that, for me personally, I've thought about quite a bit in terms of trauma and mass trauma and surviving and the psychology of that. And so I think, and also of interconnectedness and of how all of these things overlap, this pandemic and these shootings and the, you know, all of these different pieces that were like, how to bring all that together and not make sense of it, but at least maybe gain some clarity in that moment and produce something that maybe helps other people to also gain a bit more clarity. And I think that in itself is useful. So kind of as that like optimal teachable moment where we go, okay, well, at least we can kind of see this laid out now and it'll help us move forward or move within it.
Thank you. Kendra, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, well, so memoir comics and you know, the diary documentary comics are really quite different. I mean, with memoir, and there are a lot of wonderful memoir comics out there, you have the benefit of hindsight, right? And so the story that you craft is perhaps much more orderly, and you know, with that critical distance, you're able to maybe draw conclusions that you would not have when doing a comic in the moment. I think what these kinds of comics offer really are a glimpse into the authenticity of the moment that you maybe don't have in a memoir. And that's really important because so much important stuff was going on. You know, I mentioned the issues before, and then, you know, the Black Lives Matter and the protesting in response to George Floyd and other killings were happening. And my sense, and maybe this is just me, but my sense of reading these kinds of comics that are done on the ground in the moment from personal experience, perhaps incite the reader to action more so than, you know, something written after the fact. I mean, you know, so there's perhaps value in this kind of documenting comic in that respect.
Great, awesome. Another question from the chat, and just a reminder to folks, about 12 minutes remaining. And so please feel free, those of you who are attendees who have a burning question, to use that Q&A tab to put some questions in the chat. I was curious, and I'll start with Hana and Mandi. How do you think comics are changing or can change our perspectives about health issues? So comics specifically, what do you think is particularly great about them in terms of framing or changing our perspective about health issues? Great question in the chat.
I can go. The thing I love about comics is that for me, it was the closest thing to storytelling. Because when I'm telling a story to groups of kids, you know, sometimes if I want it to be scary, but not too scary for little kids, like, and then, you know, so I haven't said anything scary, but I've just said it in a way that's kind of like a little bit alarming. And with comics, that's what the illustration is. That's all the tone. I feel like comics can do so much about communicating a tone.
Yeah, you know, your book would be, and I don't know to what extent you guys have explored this, but be perfect in schools, right? Like just so perfect, right? Like as a text to teach kids about issues with and you know, informing and developing their perspectives about health. Hana, what do you think about in terms of comics being a great form for changing our perspectives?
Well, right now I'm doing my master's in art education. So clearly I think art can educate so much. So I think comics just have this other level. I mean, I love novels, but I've just learned so much while reading more comics and graphic novels over the years of just how it can just change the tone of what you're reading so much. And also as a young kid, I just, you know, you love illustrations. It just draws you to the book in a different light and a different way. And it's been really fun to work with. So I'm all in. Anything that's got art in it.
Maureen, I wanted to ask you the same question. Do you think that big teacher in terms of what comics can do you think it gets at that whole thing of privilege versus vulnerability, of shifting our perspectives about how we see those issues, and not just health issues, but beyond that?
Yes, I think to piggyback off the last question too, I think something that I love so much about comics is that the body is always there. You don't ever have disembodied voices. So the things that are sometimes abstracted in other literature can't be really, because or you'd have a super boring comic with just, gray rooms or something. But, almost every comics artist knows and loves drawing figures. And so things that are, often innately political, gender, race, ability, disability, being tall, being thin, being fat, being short, all of those things, having red hair, having dark hair, having disabilities, abilities, the whole gamut, it's always right there and present. And it also is a way of seeing how people are interacting with one another and with the biological world, with the technological world. It's all right there, and we get so much information as both as readers and as creators of comics. I think we get information from the things we draw or that are presented there for us on the page. They speak back to us. It's an animating force that doesn't exist in any other medium in quite the same way. So I think that vulnerability, I think, is very highly visible just innately. So the way we portray ourselves if we're doing memoiristic work, or the way we portray others. For me, when I drew George Floyd, for example, I had to do research and look at images of George online, and I saw other art that people had made about him. I saw murals that muralists had done of his face, and so he became a presence. He became animated for me in my mind, and I've had that experience too, doing the feminist fables before, where I created fictional stories, but they were based on real research of real people. So not some fabrication, not something abstract springing from the brain, but something that's very grounded in the world. So I think that information is really valuable.
Kendra, wonderful. Thank you, Maureen. Kendra?
Yeah, and then you have comics theorists who point out that the visual medium or the hybrid medium of comics really demands reader participation. So, and this goes to what Hannah was saying, this medium really does draw the reader in. And then when it gets to questions of vulnerability, like if someone is really exposing themselves in a memoir, that in some ways, that could be a safe space for the reader, and also for other readers, maybe insight, empathy, and looks like we're almost out of time here, but I think, and then you have the whole graphic medicine cohort who have been working on this for the past 20 or so years, and their ethos is how important comics are to convey complicated, difficult, sometimes personally distressing information, health relating to, healthcare.
Awesome. Before we go, I want everybody to have an opportunity to let those who have been in attendance today, and thank you so much for those of you who have attended the panel, to just mention how can people get a hold of your books? Where can they see you exhibiting? Do you have like an exhibit this evening, that sort of thing, the online exhibit? We'll start, we'll go Mandi, then Hannah, Maureen, and Kendra.
You can contact us through Alexander Finbow with Renegade Press. And Hannah has a little bit more social media presence than I do.
I have a little bit. I have a classic Instagram account, just Hana Kujawa Art, and a website that's just my name if you're looking for that.
Awesome. Maureen and Kendra, how can they see your stuff?
Mine is art@maureenburdock.com. So that's my website. That's probably the easiest.
Awesome. And Kendra?
You can see Maureen's wonderful contribution to the anthology in the anthology. Go to graphicmundi.org. It's also available through bookshop.org and other venues. And tonight, the Graphic Mundi has an exhibitor room. So if you're free between 8 and 10 p.m. tonight, please stop by. We're going to have a party. No real agenda. If you're an artist and have a current project you'd like to share, screen sharing will be encouraged. And that is in exhibit room D, I think. D is in doodle. So please stop by if you are not zoomed out at that point.
And Slug Story 2 or COVID Chronicles 2, just as a final sort of parting thing, are you inspired in terms of what you've worked on to now go on and kind of do that again? Are you excited to go and tell completely different stories now after going through this experience? Just curious as a final wrap-up question. Mandi and Hana?
Well, I have an idea for a ghost story, and it touches. It's got little. I've done a suicide intervention program for teenagers, right. So there's a little bit of that, and I'm hoping that I can convince Hana to work with me on that too.
You're on mute.
Oh.
Yeah. Not you, Mom.
Not you, Mom.
The only thing, who knows, maybe Mom will get some of my help. We'll see. And then I'm working on a project about other artists with health challenges in my school right now.
Amazing. Awesome. Maureen?
Well, I'm working on a big old project, the Queen of Snails, which was the Baroness of Have Nothing, and it's now the Queen of Snails. And the dissertation portion of that is finished. I just received my degree conferral letter.
Hey, congratulations.
And then Kendra and I are working on crafting that into a book. So I'm working on that for the next few months.
Nice.
Amazing.
Yep. And so my work continuing to acquire for the imprint and develop that is ongoing. Should another anthology idea present itself, I'd be happy to do that. I really enjoyed working on this first one, and we'll see what the future holds.
Amazing. So I want to thank our panelists so much for this. This has been a crazy year, and I just was thrilled when I found out that TCAF was going to, to do this. And I feel so fortunate to having met you, albeit only in this way, but I hope at one of these gatherings in the future we'll cross paths. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Take care.
Thank you. So nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.
And I'm back. Thanks so much, everybody, for this great program this afternoon. I just have a few last bits of housekeeping before I let you all get on with the rest of your day. Once again, special thanks to our programming sponsor, Seneca College School of Creative Arts and Animation. Special thanks also to the Guiding Books and Art and Page and Panel, the TCAF shop, as well as our government funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Art Council, and the Toronto Art Council. If by some magical way of the internet you have come to this without knowing about torontocomics.com, please go there. It is a great website where you can see more programming like this, as well as over 300 exhibitors from all over the world selling in our online marketplace. The exhibition runs until May 15th, and new program goes live every day until then. If you are having some trouble with the website, if you get to torontocomics.com, go to the events page. It'll bring you to all of our programming. If you enjoyed today's program, I think you will enjoy Harm Reduction and Comics, running on Saturday, May 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This panel will explore comic arts and its relationship to facilitating language around harm reduction. And I think that is everything for today. Please visit the exhibit rooms, go to torontocomics.com, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.